Oh, hi. I'm just sitting here having some DoorDash delivered Outback. It's actually quite good. Just, enjoying the apocalypse, growing a beard, letting my hair grow out, thinking about the absurdity of underground barbershops. Anyway. This is Apocalypse Cast. And welcome back. You will quickly realize that I don't actually script this show out. I pretty much go off the top of my head, though I have some idea what it is I'm going to say. Now, I've convinced myself that that's because I want to come at you with spontaneity, just a genuine zeal for this here show. Truth is, I just don't want to write the script. But I have been writing. In fact, I've been writing quite a bit on Facebook, interacting with different groups, partaking in discussions, and I've come across some interesting personages. Let's call them interesting personages. So one of these persons seems to be surrounded by a community of anarchists. It's what they are. They're anarchists. They advocate for anarchy. And I've interacted with them, and through the course of a couple of weeks, I've come out of those discussions with some interpretations and some reservations, and even some advice and some questions. And while sometimes on Facebook, those interactions, you're not face to face, you're not able to read the person's body language and their tone of voice. Sometimes how legitimate and authentic I am towards them in asking these questions is a little bit up in the air. And to be honest, sometimes I do bait them. I like to bait them a little bit and kind of, I like to piss them off. And you know what? They like to piss me off. And it happens. And usually it's in good fun. But in keeping with that spirit, I decided to ask one of those personages onto the show so that we can actually address certain characteristics of anarchy and why there are anarchists on Facebook right now advocating for our government to move towards a state of anarchy.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
What we've got here is failure to communicate.
All right, so it's time for the portion of the show that I like to call Phone an Anarchist. Oh yeah! You're an anarchist. So yeah, I've admitted and spoken to everybody here on the show that I've been doing a little writing on Facebook. I've been interacting with some folks, some interesting personages, and a lot of them are anarchists, at least some, and they're not just anarchists in the closet. They're a full-fledged, we're anarchists, we're here, get used to it, and
we're not going away.
Yeah, and we're going to change the world kind of attitude towards anarchy, which is crazy, right? Because when you think of anarchy, you think of Lord Humongous from The Road Warrior, and yeah, that
Hollywood tends to do that sort of thing, or The Purge, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. The Purge is a great example.
Perfect example.
Right. So anarchy is perceived to be this chaotic state of lawlessness. I mean, you yourself, right? You're like, you're like Rambo, right? You're like, you've got a long knife and you hang out in the woods, you jump on deer, like you walk around with it on your back. Oh, you do all that kind of stuff.
Spread the word around.
Yeah, you do all that stuff.
No, I don't do any of that stuff.
Okay. So you're not in the woods. You're not a savage.
No, and just like every other political group, we're not homogeneous. There's a lot of different people of a lot of different backgrounds. Within anarchy.
Yeah. Well, it would have to be, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a confluence of ideas and variables coming together, right? Um,
Right.
which is probably the biggest criticism of anarchy is there's so many different ideas coming together that it's impossible. It would be impossible to get everyone to agree without some leadership or some enforcement of regulations and
Yeah.
structure.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Which there are strains of it. See, there's different strains of anarchy, just like there's different strains of progressivism, or different strains of socialism, or different strains of conservatism. So there's different strains of anarchy too. So yeah, some strains are like that. They don't want to have anything like that at all. And then there's other strains, ones that I tend to adhere to, who, structure and having leaders, that's not a problem. So.
right, right. So on your Facebook community, you've got quite a bit of followers, and sometimes you post some things that are somewhat controversial. You get a lot of heat for it. I sometimes jump on there and give you a lot of heat for it. Um,
But we have fun.
we do, but I think that your anarchist brotherhood doesn't quite understand where I'm coming from when I poke fun at you, because they pop out of the shadows like a bunch of ninjas to try to tear me a new one.
And samurai.
Yeah, and samurai, they would be Ronin because they are samurais without masters.
Master, like Satoichi or something.
Yes, exactly. So these guys, they jump in there and they really try to tear me a new one. And the problem is that on Facebook, sometimes what you type comes off a little bit more hostile than it's meant to be, and there's a lot of misunderstandings. And also, I believe, especially nowadays with social media being so prevalent, we have so many conversations with so many different people that when we interact with an individual, we bring into that conversation a perception of whatever group we're raging against, and that individual becomes the personification of that group. They're no longer they're no longer an individual that you're speaking to, but rather, are you drinking whiskey? You've given some criticism of how the government is handling the whole COVID thing. Early on, from the very beginning, you were making comments about this, not just lately, because a lot of people have jumped on that bandwagon as of late, but you were from day one
of the
saying,
first.
yes, we're saying that it was heading in the wrong direction, and that it was problematic for various reasons. And I think one of the usual reactions to that is, well, you're a bastard. You want a lot of people to die.
Millions of people to die.
Yes, you want people to die. You're a bastard. I used to bait you all the time because I wanted you to admit that you were into survival of the fittest. Because, you're an anarchist.
I don't admit to.
Yeah. So you're an anarchist, so you want to be into the survival of the fittest thing. Like 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, Mad Max, Thunderdome type of shit. But
there are anarchists like that, but there's people along the political spectrum that are like that. Conservatives are like that, being war hawks. Whoever has the best army, survival of the fittest, or the whole eugenics thing with fascism and communism back in the day. Stuff like that. So,
absolutely. Now, here's the thing: you have never advocated for doing absolutely nothing and just letting COVID run free, even though that's
correct.
What some people will perceive based on your posts.
Right.
You advocated for precautions, even extreme precautions, detailed precautions, but you just didn't want to see the shutdown that's occurred.
Right, voluntary precautions primarily, and then if something happens that can be definitively attributed to somebody doing something awry or whatever, then that person suffers some kind of consequence, not necessarily jail or something, but they could possibly be sued or whatever. And that's how an anarcho-society would generally look at things.
So you think people should have stayed at home, and if they went out, they would be taking a risk and possibly even incurring some consequences?
Yes.
But
which seems common sense and fair-minded and natural.
But what you don't agree with at all is, let's say, a family going through the park and being told they can't be there, or even in some cases I'm hearing them getting arrested for being in the park. Is that something
public
you've been hearing
property
as well?
is different than private property? Yeah, a private institution can do whatever they want. The supermarket can deny anybody it wants. Well, it should be able to deny anybody that it wants to. But something like a public beach, like what's happened in Florida, or like Central Park in New York or something like that. That should be held. Yeah, that shouldn't apply to that.
Now, is it fair to say that part of the reason why they took these precautions is because in the beginning they weren't closing down the beaches, right? They were very slow to move on this.
But I knew they would.
Yeah, they were very slow. Yeah, they were very slow to move on it. I think honestly, I think our president didn't want to move on it because he saw.
And I appreciate him for that.
Yeah, I think he saw the impact it would have on the economy, and he was trying to avoid it at all costs. But it came to a point where keeping the beaches open, at one point, it was spring breakers all over the place, and they were being interviewed. And
and then they spread it around and everything else.
Yeah, and some of these spring breakers were like, I'm young, I'm healthy, and I don't care,
Right.
And
right.
When that happens, doesn't the government then need to step in and say, well, this can't be allowed, they're endangering everyone?
As a voice of reason, yeah, but not like going in with like billy clubs and arresting people like that paddleboard guy on the middle of the ocean in California, for example, who wasn't doing squat to anybody. But yeah,
he was out in the middle of the ocean, nobody around him.
Yeah, and they were still, and then guys without masks or gloves, crowded around him and took him to a jail to at least file out paperwork. I don't know if they put him in jail, in a cage, but they at least took him to a facility with other people where he had to file paperwork. It's like, isn't that a bit of a contradiction there?
Yes. Yeah, I can see where the logic of that breaks down fairly quickly. Now, just for clarification, I myself am not an anarchist. I don't have any anarchist ties or inclinations, but I'm also not an individual who believes in not speaking out against things when he sees something that's unjust or something that's problematic. I will speak out against it.
Right.
I'm by no means someone who would claim the government is perfect and cannot use any kind of reform. I don't think you can even find a politician that would ever claim that. It's pretty obvious that government should evolve and constantly be questioned and constantly be restructured and just be put into its place so that it serves the people rather than what
we all hope.
Yes, right.
Reform usually leads to bigger government, more bureaucracy, and more laws and statutes and everything else. So, it just makes itself bigger because that's the whole purpose of government is basically to make itself bigger.
Yeah, well, and right. I don't think government will ever seek to make itself smaller.
No government ever has.
Right, but
willingly.
Yeah.
Willingly.
But here's the thing. With this situation with COVID going on right now, what is happening is a lot of people are bringing up their political agendas because it's a perfect time to take shots at the government because they're handling certain things in a manner which a lot of folks would say is incompetent, and some folks will even say is tyrannical. So a lot of folks are then saying, hey, this is the perfect time to advance our agenda because we have perfect examples of what we've been warning people about right in front of us. And I feel that a lot of the anarchists have kind of had their feathers ruffled at this because they feel like this is their time to be heard because people are more willing to listen to them because of what they're experiencing. Would you say that's
Hopefully.
fair? Yes.
Hopefully, yeah.
Right.
Which we're actually, many of us getting disheartened and realizing that there's even more people who will not hear what we have to say than we originally thought, including people that were basically what we thought were in our camps, like libertarians and minarchists. Minarchists are people who want the bare minimum government. Something like the Libertarian Party, they're saying things like, this is all good and fine and dandy for the most part. And we're like, what? So the number of people the percentage of the population is already tiny who would think like myself or, the folks that you've interacted with on my Facebook page, but we've come to realize that it's even tinier than we originally thought. So it's even more of an uphill battle.
Right. So no one's claiming that anarchists are going to take over the country anytime soon.
It's going to be if everything went smoothly, it would be a 2 to 3 generation process. So you're looking at least 50 to 75 years for getting where we currently are. Like if everything went in our favor, getting from where we currently are to getting to the kind of society that we would hope for, which is if we had to find a society on Earth that would kind of resemble what we have now, that people would go, oh yeah, I'm okay with that kind of society. It'd be more in the lines of something like Hong Kong, or even Liechtenstein. I know that's a very tiny country, and I know Hong Kong is very small too. But take that as a parameter and work off of that as a compare and contrast. That's what we would be gearing ourselves toward, something like that.
Gotcha. So, but
Right.
you're not advocating for all of government to go away tomorrow.
Right. It'll take probably up to a century in order for that to occur.
Right. So you acknowledge that if government disappeared tomorrow, the whole of society would tear itself apart.
Right. You have to be practical.
Right. Because, I mean, I under these circumstances, under COVID-19, I mean, we couldn't even control people's, thirst for toilet paper.
It requires a cultural cultivation, not like the Cultural Revolution of now, but it would take more of a freedom-minded orientation toward like the founding of this country. Like the founding of this country was great. I think just about every anarchist and libertarian, I can't speak for them, but I can just suppose they would be happy with living not with the technology and stuff, like modern technology, whatever, with a 1790s kind of governmental framework where it's very
I follow you.
Off and very minimal.
I follow you. Yeah, it's very hard for me when it comes to technology. See, I love the 80s. I'm obsessed with the 80s. And and the one thing I hate about that is that I would love to go back in time and live in the 80s, except that I would miss all the cool technology that we have now.
Right.
So what I would ideally want is kind of like a retro technology, like all the technology from today somehow becomes 80s, like stylized with an
That's
80s
what I'm
flair.
talking about. Like making a shift to like an 80s culture again.
So what year did you mention?
For what?
You were just talking about people who wanted to live in a certain time period?
Oh, like the 1790s.
Okay, wouldn't it be cool to have a fictional world where the technology of today fit into the aesthetic of that era and just see how society would evolve from that point onward? And for those that are watching this, the reason why I'm saying that is because Jay, I refer to him as Mr. Book. I actually called him Mr. Book, a moniker that he has now taken gladly.
And it's the online world.
Yes, but Jay is also a writer, and he writes fiction. He writes all different kinds of things. He's ghostwritten some stuff that I'm sure he can't really talk about, and I wouldn't want him to talk about. But he's also a professional librarian. He's also a very educated individual who is a bibliophile. Just reads more than any human being I've ever known. So, do you think that's an accurate description of you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I love books. I got books surrounding me all over the place. If anybody ever wants any recommendations for, like, how do I get an easy introductory book or some literature on anarcho thoughts or libertarian thoughts or something like that, by all means, I have plenty I could recommend.
The whole idea behind Apocalypse Cam was, number one is it was just inspired because of the whole thing with COVID, and it was just a way for me to start talking to people, and I put in the caption Apocalypse Cam, and some folks asked me to go ahead and do it as one of the shows on my channel, and I said, you know what, that would be fun, but I wouldn't want it to be a show about COVID, right? Because, I mean, that's just kind of limited.
Right.
And it's not very imaginative. And this isn't really a political show. This is more of a world building and world deconstructing show. And one of my favorite things to do, as I do fancy myself somewhat of a fantasy writer, is world building, the creating of worlds and how they work, and deconstructing them and examining each individual part. I think that's a fascinating thing. So as a thought experiment, sometimes I think from where we are right now, I think there are two dominant forms of anarchistic society that we tend to think of in our pop culture, right? And one of them is the Mad Max scenario, right? Where it's all these warlords and they're fighting for resources, and it's wasteland and mutants, and it's pretty darn awesome, right? It's pretty darn awesome. Yeah, you wouldn't want to live there. You wouldn't want to live there, but if you could visit every once in a while and, and get into a scuffle and, drive down the road and, it would be pretty fantastic. But that's one version of that. But I think everyone would agree that they don't want the world to be that way. It's not exactly
including us.
Yes, exactly. It's not an idealistic view of the world. Then the other extreme, I would say, I call the Blade Runner world, right? So basically, it's that cyberpunk mentality where government has dissolved, or rather, it's been overtaken by corporate interests to the point where corporations are now really the governments, and they have a very large amount of control, and they can basically dictate how the society is shaped, and they war with each other. It's an interesting dynamic, and I call that the Blade Runner type universe, right? And those are the two extremes, I think, when we think about anarchy, right? Neither one of those scenarios is necessarily lawless, right? Because in both those scenarios, the corporations have their own rules and regulations and manners in which they interact with each other. And even in the Mad Max world, there's all these different tribes, and they have their own rules and hierarchies and respect for one another. And there's like honor among thieves, you know, unless you violate some kind of thing, or unless you're not part of their group, in which case you're basically, they can do whatever they want to you, right? So there's horrific things, but there is some kind of system in place, right? So if we were to go right now and start implementing anarchy, we both agree that if it was overnight, it would be chaos. The world would tear itself apart. I honestly think it would be something like the Purge.
Anarchy.
People would just be scared out of their mind.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it would be very Purge-like. Yeah.
It would be very Purge-like. But I always hold that the variable between those two worlds is how quickly anarchy takes hold. Okay, so would you say that is that's true? That if you were to take away government at a very quick pace, you may very well end up with Mad Max. Whereas if you do it gradually, you'll end up more on the spectrum of Blade Runner, which, by the way, is not exactly an ideal. I mean, cyberpunk society sounds cool theoretically, but if you know about cyberpunk, it's not. You're basically you are not a human being. You're pretty much.
It's cool to fly around in Zeppelins, but
it looks cool, but it is not exactly. It's not a utopia. It is definitely a dystopian future. So, would you say that that's the reflection of how quickly government dissolves that creates either one of those economies?
Yeah. Two things. One, anarchy is no rulers but rules, going to what you were saying. So there is some kind of rules that people in a community agree to abide by, and they will voluntarily sign a contract, as opposed to the classical social contract theory from the 1700s. Yes, and the thing is, it's not even so much laziness on the part of the sci-fi or fantasy writer. It's just there's a certain thing that they want to focus on, a certain message, a certain narrative, a certain character, a certain society, whatever it might be. And even the Bible doesn't even talk about the development of the whole world over time, kind of a thing. And you can see that sort of thing, I would say, in like Star Trek, for example, or Star Wars, where you have a world that's completely one thing. So you have one world that's completely just one big gigantic city, or you have another world that's just one big gigantic desert, or whatever. And I think on the cultural, political level, that's what happens in Mad Max, and that's what happens with Blade Runner, wherein, for expediency's sake, for efficiency, because you don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts details of how a prolonged process would have taken, society or government collapses right away. And then you have a Mad Max world, or you have a Blade Runner world. And I think it's just more of a, let's just cut to the chase and continue with the story kind of a thing, as opposed to having things get drawn out and played out. Now, sometimes it works fine, like The Girl with All the Gifts, for example. That's a movie that was made in the UK based upon a novel. It's a zombie one, but it's based upon like a fungus that infects everybody and turns them into zombies.
Oh, that's interesting, because I'm not familiar with that.
So definitely a different take. Yeah. Or you have something like Station 11, which is being made into a miniseries, I think.
Station 11,
it's a flu, but the fungus
throws
off the world. Yeah, or The Stand.
The stand. Well, that's it's a classic.
Yeah, well, the fungus is like it's like a mushroom thing, and
That's really
is,
I know
it's
you're not
different.
I know you're not a gamer, but I'm a gamer, and we talk a lot about gaming on my channel. And I don't know if you're familiar with a game called The Last of Us.
I've heard of it.
Yes, absolutely beautiful game with a great story. It's one of the top rated games ever, and that game actually is about a fungus that infects people's brains and puts them into a zombie-like state.
Zombie-like thing.
So I'm kind of wondering if maybe they actually based some of that off of the subject, off of the source material you're mentioning.
I think Girl with All the Gifts came out around like 2012, 2014.
Yeah, it's about the timeline about lines up. So I'm definitely going to look into that because I think that would be an interesting thing that if those things are connected.
I don't think the movie was ever released in America, so you have to find it like Netflix or Hulu or something.
I'll find it.
BBC streaming if they have that or whatever.
Yeah,
but yeah, in that case, everything collapses overnight. That's understandable for that particular storyline. But with something like Blade Runner or Mad Max,
Blade Runner, it is quite frankly a very gradual dissolving of the government. That's how we ended up there. But with Mad Max, it isn't that anarchy rose in place of government. It's actually that anarchy is all that's left after the government collapses. And in the Mad Max timeline, the government does collapse pretty quickly due to a shortage of resources, gasoline and whatnot. There's a whole. I mean, George Miller, who created the Mad Max world, has basically tomes, like huge tomes of everything that happened in that world. But yet, what you see on film is very minimal.
Right, and that's all you're going off of.
Right, but if that's why I feel that world is so brilliant because it emotes so much without telling you anything. And it just sparks the imagination. But yet, George Miller knows every detail of that world. Mm-hmm. And over the years, bits and pieces of it have come out. Whereas a lot of people look at that world and think it doesn't make any sense and it's completely without reason. No, there's a very specific reason why everything is the way it is in that world.
And anarchy isn't really taught in schools at all. You might hear about it for a split second in American history class, and you think of Sacco and Vanzetti, or some other very extreme left-wing anarchists who tried to bomb the government into oblivion or something like that with a few bombs, which was stupid. But
now you would say those are individual wackadoos more than anarchist leaders.
Yeah. Because there was.
I mean, you wouldn't advocate for someone to project anarchy by attacking the government. I mean,
no, actually, and that's one of the foundational principles of anarchism, which is, I would say, it falls under the libertarian umbrella, and probably one of the bedrock foundational principles of libertarianism and therefore anarchism is the NAP, which is an acronym for the non-aggression principle, which is something akin to basically like the golden rule, and you try to be as pacifist as possible. It's okay to in self-defense to be violent, but other than that, you don't aggress against your neighbor, you don't get aggressed against their property. It's a very I know it seems all kind of crazy with all the stuff out there from The Walking Dead to Mad Max, but it's a very
Walking Dead's a good one. Walking Dead's a good one.
Back in the beginning, you could do anything.
Daryl, stop!
But it's not like that anymore.
We need some rules. This is how we treat each other. And this is what happens when we don't.
Because they're
very non-violent worldview.
Yeah, because I mean, The Walking Dead's really.
If people upheld it, if people adhered to the standards that it sets for itself, then
yeah. But I think that's where a lot of the criticism of anarchy comes in. That yes, ideally, as an ideal, it works very well, and everyone respects each other and respects these boundaries, but there are going to be people who push the envelope and don't play by your rules, and how are you going to enforce that upon them?
Well, that's where the rest of society comes in. And one of the things that you and I have gone back and forth with is when it comes to having a centralized power, governmental power of some kind, you're going to be able to grow your power and concentrate various things and grow certain things like your arsenal and develop things like nuclear weapons. But in an anarcho-society, it goes right down to the individual, which is the most diluted, concentrated form of power you can get. as compared to a massive army with like China has like 1.5 million people just in its army. Then you got the Navy and the Air Force and everything else. Whereas with anarchy, it's just the individual. Yes, the individual can probably get some people on its side, his or her side, and form something like an HOA, a militarized HOA, for example, a homeowners association, for those who don't know what HOAs are. And but the thing is, it's so constrained; it can only do so much, and the rest of society will push back on that individual or that individual and his or her followers, to the point where they really won't be able to do much of anything. They can make it a little bit of an impact, but it wouldn't be sustaining. It would be completely untenable, and it would fall apart pretty quickly.
So
because you figure, I mean, we have a huge prison population here in the United States, but that's because we have so many more laws on the books than we ever did before, et cetera, et cetera. If you break it down to just the most basic kind of crimes like murder or stealing or rape or whatever, how much of a percentage of a population really are hardened, want to be criminal, intentional criminals? It's a very small percentage of the population in and of itself. And if the whole society is willing to, like in this case, all of society is willing to give government emergency powers. Now, if you take all the people in the United States that are willing to give the government emergency powers during this crisis, and can like flick a switch and they're all anarcho in their thinking, then it's a very tenable situation. But like I said, that would take 2 or 3 generations at least.
So what I'm getting from you is that, what I'm understanding from you is that it's really a matter of, with government, you have a very strong concentration of power, and you would like to dilute that power and spread it evenly across, so that even when evil rises, it can be snuffed out because you'd be able to see it because the power is distributed. And with that distribution of power, there would be less places for corruption to hide.
Right, and it happened in the Old West. I know Hollywood's portrayed it as a very crazy, anarcho-violent purge kind of place, but it was actually pretty darn safe according to a growing number of studies on the subject.
Don't say that to Seth MacFarlane, because he made a movie.
I know.
Very much indicating.
Ways to Die in the West. That's great. I love the movie. I love the book.
I think you and I are one of the only 2 people who like that movie.
Oh, really?
It did not do very well. No.
Or what was the one, Ballad of Bud Skaggs or whatever? That's a good one too.
Yeah. Hey, I'm still really thrilled that Doc Brown made an appearance in that movie. That just made my day.
Yeah, that was awesome right there. You can't get better. You can't top that. Another example, though, would be pre-America, meaning colonial America, where if a governor overreached or whatever, he would get tarred and feathered and kicked out of town. But he wasn't like necessarily beat up or killed or anything like that. And there are plenty of examples of that happening, especially in places like Massachusetts and Virginia. And
you think the society as it is right now can go back to that kind of structure?
Our grandkids, if we start working on it with us and with our kids and our grandkids, maybe by the time our great-grandkids or our great-grandkids come along,
Now, I've reached out to some of the people in your anarchist community, and what I was trying to advise them of was that perhaps the term anarchy has come and gone, that perhaps that is not the right way to do this. I mean, you could describe what you've described and say that you want to head into a evolved form of government, a decentralized form of government. And by saying that, people would probably be more willing to listen to you than if you just said anarchy. So in a very real way, I believe that the anarchist community has a PR problem, a branding problem.
It has potential, but has branding problem.
Yes. So my suggestion was, why don't you guys rebrand and really play some PR and really try to find ways to get people interested? A lot of the pushback I got was that, well, anarchy doesn't need to change. The way we communicate it doesn't need to change. People need to change in order to understand us, which is a very elitist mentality. So with that kind of mentality, I find it hard to believe that the harmony that you're describing can exist when they are so rigid in people conforming to their thought process rather than them meeting them halfway and saying, well, yeah, we won't call it anarchy, and perhaps we won't do it this way, and it'll be a decentralized government, and we'll dissolve this over time, and we'll let just in steps. But they want to jump right to anarchy, right to that end result, and I think that end result is what scares everyone. So my suggestion was to kind of do it in a here comes the airplane, here's one bite kind of a way, and they didn't really acquiesce to that. I thought that was valid criticism, and it did not go over well. Why do you think that is?
Well, I'll say that it's an ongoing conversation within the libertarian / anarcho community to begin with, rebranding and all that sort of thing. I think those who feel that way or think that way do so because language is a fickle science, art, discipline, whatever you want to term it. And it's very easy to turn a concept around on a dime. So, for example, I think it was either Wilson or FDR within one administration made the term conservative out to be like a crazy elitist kind of, they want to take us back to the Stone Age kind of a thing.
So what you're saying is that if you rebrand anarchy or soften some of the concepts into a more gradual dissolving of the government, eventually people will see through that and be like, well, you're really just talking about anarchy, and then you're back on the same boat.
Right.
Okay. But I mean, when I hear you talk like that, yeah, I find it hard to have much faith that the anarchy movement is going to get off the ground anytime soon.
Because we're so small, the population. Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah. What people do find attractive about it is freedom, absolute and total freedom. The Walking Dead is a horrible situation, but those people are free. Right,
and that's instinctual. That goes, what are the Terrible Twos all about? I want to do what I want to do, and I don't care what you say. Mm-hmm. What do you think all the teenage rebellion stuff is about? That's libertarian and anarcho instincts kicking in.
But do you watch The Living Dead?
The Walking Dead?
Yeah, I'm sorry, The Walking Dead.
I watched it through like the middle of season 7.
Okay, because if you know that show started very much where I'm describing, where everyone was just free, and it was just chaos. But it has evolved into towns and government. Right. It actually has evolved into a form of a kind of what you're talking about. So,
right.
Yeah. So while it is a fictional universe, and I get a lot of flack about this when I talk about these things in anarchist groups, they're like, well, all you talk about is movies and books and fictional stuff. And I go, well, you're talking about theoretical concepts. So I'm talking about fictional concepts. I mean, they're still based on theory. And I mean, these are not shows that are written by morons. These are shows that are written by intelligent fiction. I think it informs our social consciousness. And I think it's okay to reference these things because they're theoretical constructs of what you and I are speaking about here, about what happens when government and society goes away in various different degrees for various. I mean, in the Walking Dead, there's a zombie apocalypse. I mean, I'm pretty sure nobody wants a zombie. I mean, I wanted a little bit, like a little bit.
Therefore, you're not going to get bitten or something
like a little bit. I mean, I think on some level we all wanted a little bit, because you get to be a badass and wear guns and shoot and blow zombies' heads off and stuff like that. And but then when you really think about it, the rational part of your brain says, no, that'd be terrible, But the bang bang, kid in you would love to have that Wild West kind of freedom. And I think that a lot of the time that's what people think of anarchists, that they're just kind of naive.
Like Sons of Anarchy or something, like motorcycle gangs driving around.
The Sons of Anarchy is a fantastic show. And those guys... Those guys are anarchists. They just live in our society, but they're anarchists, right? And if you watch the show,
they're a little more violent than we.
If you watch the show, if you watch the show, they're not the greatest guys. So that's another example on how anarchy gets tied to a group of violent criminal bikers, and then you're saying, I want an anarchist society, but yet our society recognizes anarchy as such. So
Right.
that is a very, very tough battle.
But
That's
you
a
know
very
what?
tough sale.
The thing is, people tend to gravitate toward anarcho-libertarian characters. Rambo, for example, especially First Blood, the very first one. You have the government come down on Rambo, and he's just trying to make his way home after being messed up by the government during the
Right,
draft.
Rambo's the hero. Right, we all
or
feel
you
for
have
him.
Breaking Bad. That's huge.
Breaking Bad, which I only watched recently, and I thought it was a really, really beautifully written show.
It's a libertarian-minded kind of slant to it.
Well,
you know,
another good example is you think of fictional universes. You gave us some really grounded examples, but you have someone like Han Solo, who's basically an anarchist at heart. Doesn't want to.
Everybody loves him.
Yeah, doesn't want to join up with any. Doesn't want to join with the rebellion. Doesn't want to join with the Empire. He wants to be free, man. You know.
Star Wars is an excellent example because you have the Jedi Council, right? And the Jedi Council is like private security. Really, they're making sure everything stays. They're keepers.
They're keepers of the peace.
Right. And if you have an issue, you reach out to the Jedis. They're like the Supreme Court, so to speak. So you work your way through whatever you work through, and if nothing else helps, then you turn to the Jedis, and then the Jedis come and help you out. But then you also have, the Skywalkers and the Rebellion and everything else. Who are they rebelling against? The Empire, because the guy wants to control everything. It's libertarian, or even, I wouldn't say it's necessarily anarcho, because some of the people who are rebelling are like princesses, like Princess Leia, and other heads of government who just want to
the rebellion. The rebellion is
libertarian minded.
The rebellion is fighting the evil empire, but it's not like they want a lawless state. They want to instill. I mean, it's really empire versus republic. Is really what that is. So in that sense, on the macro scale, I don't think it works as good as an example. But there's definitely individual.
But on the individual scale, like Han Solo,
Lando Calrissian,
the
Chewbacca, the Mandos. Yeah, like there are so many different pockets. And if you've noticed, those are the ones that are most romanticized by fans. There are fans who love Han Solo more than Luke Skywalker easily. They're Han Solo guys, Another one that you may not be familiar with, but I strongly suggest if you want to spend, it's a very small binge because there's only about 16 episodes and the show went off the air, even though it has an amazing cult following. There is a movie that kind of wraps things up, but that is Firefly. Firefly is an amazing show, and Malcolm Reynolds is basically an anarchist. And he is super charismatic, and people just love him. But that guy, if he was your poster boy for anarchy, people would listen. So that's what I'm talking about. I mean, why don't you guys have a Malcolm Reynolds or a Han Solo amongst your community that can rally people? Or
Captain America.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the movies, like if you talk to a libertarian or an anarchist and you say to them, like, what's one of the best movies that you would recommend to give somebody, when they're first dipping their toes into things? Captain America: Civil War. Yeah, Tony Stark, who is the corporatism kind of thing that goes along with Blade Runner.
We all love Tony, though. We love Tony, though. We love Tony. Everybody loves Tony.
I mean, we love both sides. That's the thing. But then you have the Captain America side, who's like, well, everybody knows. It's like, no. And if you had, like, libertarians in the theater, every time the Captain America's team would do something great, you hear, yeah. Well, so that's a perfect example.
It is. It actually is a very good example because I always thought there was a little bit of irony in there, right? Because I mean, you would think the character called Captain America would be the one on the government's side, would be the one under the flag. But in reality, during the course of that movie, he disassociates himself with the moniker of Captain America. If you notice, the red, white, and blue becomes black.
Yeah.
So he basically says, I'm Steve Rogers. He doesn't even want to call himself Captain America. So and the weird part is
got Guardians of the Galaxy too.
Yeah, and the weird part about it is that he doesn't do that as a betrayal of America, but the character is doing that because he wants to protect America, and he feels that the only way to protect America is to take it from the government, which is a very deep concept in a Marvel movie. Of all things,
it's amazing.
Mr. Book, I will see you next time.
All right, next time.
Bye-bye. Okay, so this episode ran rather long, hence I had to cut it off. I'm still experimenting with the format and the content, but I hope you all enjoyed this discussion on anarchy and how it's reflected in the fictional apocalypses we all love. I know what some of you are thinking. I promise you all a getting into shape for the apocalypse segment with Ring Fit for Nintendo Switch, but it's gonna have to wait till next episode. I'm sorry, guys. But hey, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, hit thumbs up, clicking the notification bell would be really awesome of you. And by all means, comment on the subject and on the films we brought up, the fictional apocalypses, on anarchy, on our guest, Mr. Book. Whatever it is you want to comment on, we welcome all of it. And listen, Cronus Film and Geekery Network is basically just me. And while it's a tiny channel now, I very much am hoping to build a community. Doing so means more of a regular schedule as far as uploads and evolution of the content. So please support the channel, and thank you for viewing.